Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to my channel, I Hate Rock Music. And today I'm going to do a video about Soft Machine. But I'm going to focus in on the Robert Wyatt years because that's when the band was the most distinctive. And I like the Soft Machine albums after Wyatt left, but they're more standard rock affairs or jazz rock affairs, heavy on the jazz, all instrumental, and a revolving bunch of players. And they're still notable by the contributions of Mike Ratledge on keyboards, which gives them, or it helps maintain that Soft Machine identity. But I think the years 1967 and 1972, when Robert Wyatt was in the group, are the most essential and a unique band. And they have quite a history, as it turns out. As I pointed out, the Robert Wyatt version of the band essentially existed from 1967 up to the very beginning of 1972. And incredible evolution of the band in that shorter period. Each album is a radical and distinct departure from what they did before, and that makes their catalog all the more interesting. So they started actually in 1966 with Mike Ratledge on keyboards, Robert Wyatt on drums, Kevin Ayers on bass and vocals, David Allen on guitar, and Larry Nolan on guitar. But by later of 1966, Larry Nolan departed, so they were down to a one guitar band. And then they did a lot of shows in 66 and 1967, and they weren't received very well, which is kind of surprising when you listen to the material from that period. It's hard to see how it would have been offensive to anyone, although there was that heavy keyboard dominance and they were really loud. But apparently they would do long, stretched out pieces, so there wasn't room for people to boo. But anyway, they were definitely playing the underground clubs. They couldn't have access to some of the main venues, so they stayed at places like Middle Earth and the UFO Club. And then 1967, they released their first 45, Love Makes Sweet Music, which is kind of a pop ditty but quirky. And they got signed to Polydor in the UK, and then got signed to Probe Records in the United States. And they did record a demo in 1967 with the full lineup at Delane Studios, so they had access to a 16-track studio and great production, top of the line. And they recorded the album Jet Propelled Photographs, but those demos were shelved and weren't released until 1972. But they give a great glimpse of the 1967 band and the fact that they were doing the kind of material they were doing in 1967 is pretty impressive to think about that material being recorded the same year that Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles came out. And so they toured Europe and particularly France in 1967, and that's when David Allen left, their remaining guitar player, and then he went on to form Gong. And so one of the more interesting things about this milieu of the Canterbury sound, within a couple of years of Soft Machine doing what they did, there was a huge explosion of bands coming out of the Canterbury region, and they have kind of a similar sound and aesthetic. So it's really interesting that the whole sound was associated with that vicinity, and a lot of them had keyboards, dominant keyboards in them, and that's one of the things that set them apart. Also, these progressive arrangements and direction, and you kind of have to give credit to Soft Machine in some respects. They pretty much were the inventors of progressive rock in the UK, and as I pointed out, by 67 or 68, Soft Machine was doing their material, and literally within a year or two, all of a sudden we had a explosion of bands, including a lot of spin-offs from Soft Machine itself. David Allen forming Gong, and then Quiet Sun and Caravan and all the rest all popped up. So it was a pretty lively scene with a really interesting sounds, and that whole scene produced a lot of interesting musicians and bands going into the early 70s, a virtual explosion. So then famously they got tapped. they had the same management company as Jimi Hendrix, and they got tapped to open the North American tour for Jimi Hendrix, and Jimi Hendrix was quite impressed with them, and to the point where they they collaborated some, and there's some studio jams with members of Soft Machine and Hendrix, so potentially they could have worked together if Hendrix didn't have such a busy schedule at the time. It seems likely they would have done some more work together, particularly Robert Wyatt. Really impressed Jimi Hendrix as a drummer, which is saying something since Mitch Mitchell was in the Hendrix Experience, of course. And there's actually some overlap between Mitch Mitchell and Robert Wyatt's drummings. Robert Wyatt is definitely a little quirkier, but he was working in a quirkier format, so that's to be expected. But both of them had a lot of jazz chops too, and so I see a lot of affinity between those two drummers. And when they toured the U.S., actually Andy Summers, who later ended up in the Police, joined the band to fill in for David Allen leaving. And so they toured with Andy Summers. And there, I'll post this below. There's actually a live recording from 1968 in Davenport, Ohio, opening for Hendrix, and Andy Summers is on there. He was quite a presence on guitar. Really definitely had a huge impact on the way the band sounded. But apparently Kevin Ayers wasn't happy with it, and I can understand it was definitely a departure for what they were doing. And so Kevin Ayers had Andy Summers booted out, but then ironically Kevin Ayers left soon after that himself. And so December of 1968, Hugh Hopper, who had been their road manager, joined the group as bassist. And it's kind of amazing that he was just the road manager, because he's a very impressive bass player, and his fuzz bass on the first couple of Soft Machine albums is really impressive and really commands your attention, really added a lot to their sound, particularly being such a small unit band. And so by 1968, they put out their first album, and ironically, it was recorded in New York City. They didn't record it in the UK. And the first album is really interesting, just like jet-propelled photographs. It shows a really peculiar band. They're not really psychedelic, although there's some psychedelic elements, and they're marked by a prominence of keyboards, which really set them apart. And they weren't very dense, and there wasn't a bunch of guitars. And so that really set them apart from all the other bands around at the time that were doing pop format with a lot of guitars and kind of all the notable things that we came to associate with psychedelic music, with weird guitar things, and then basically crooners on vocals. And with Soft Machine, of course, we had Kevin Ayers with his low vocals, and then we had Robert Wyatt with his strange, breathy, high vocals. And so they had a very peculiar sound right off the bat, and then that first album really showcases that. Complex, oblique arrangements, a lot of quirky ideas about how to pull off a song, and then Robert Wyatt's interesting lyrics, and then its totally unique vocal style. And then in 1969, they released the second record, Two, which completely goes in a different direction, and you can hear a lot of what one would call jazz rock fusion in a way, with Hugh Hopper's fuzz bass and horn charts, and Robert Wyatt playing a lot of really jazzy drums, and it's quite a landscape. I can compare it to Pink Floyd's Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and that sort of material, where it's just a really interesting landscape with Robert Wyatt's strange vocals, these peculiar arrangements, and then a lot of rock elements and a lot of jazz elements. And I think the second album is really forward-looking and really laid the groundwork for what was to come as far as the Canterbury sound and jazz rock tendencies. Also in 1969, they Incognito, they recorded backed Syd Barrett on a couple of tracks on Madcap Laughs, and Syd Barrett would work with Soft Machine a number of times. There's some bootleg material out there as well. So that affinity between early Pink Floyd and Soft Machine is not an accident, and so it's no surprise that the musicians in those two bands would um, collaborate to some extent. And then in 1970, they signed with CBS Records in the United States, and Brian Hopper uh, joined the band on saxophone, and they essentially became a quartet. No guitar player in the band, and they also expanded the lineup. 1970 was the album Third, which is their best-selling album and a really interesting record. It's all one big suite, more or less, and then there's only one vocal tune on there, Moon and June, with Robert Wyatt. What a great record. I think that's a definitive record for them. Most people agree it sold the best, and it had the band, except for that one tune, going in a complete instrumental direction with the keyboard dominating, and Mike Ratledge's distinctive electronic keyboard sounds, which he started using on Soft Machine 2, really came to dominate and really define the sound of the band. And it's really a wonderful thing. I could definitely see Hendrix collaborating with them, bass, drums, and keyboards. There would have been a great room. And then that same year, they expanded to become a sextet with Robert Wyatt, Mike Ratledge, Hugh Hopper, and then they added Elton Dean, Lynn Dobson, Mark Sherrick, and Nick Evans, all on reeds and trumpet. And it didn't last very long. Thankfully, we have a expanded version of the third album now that has some tracks by the expanded lineup, because it didn't last very long. Mark Sherrick and Nick Evans left after 2 months, and then Lynn Dobson left after 6 months, so that just left Elton Dean. And so once again, they became a quartet. And then in 1971, they recorded their final album with Robert Wyatt, and it's a kind of the format that Soft Machine adopted after that. The lyrics and vocals are all gone. They have a reed player. It's definitely jazz, and it has some rock elements to it. And Mike Ratledge keyboards continue to be distinctive and interesting. And Robert Wyatt's drumming is incredible. And that's one of the things that sets those records apart, even as their electric jazz albums. And I also find it interesting, too, that the band was mining this territory both before, during, and after Miles Davis had created electric jazz, particularly with the fact that Miles Davis used a lot of keyboards. And I know it's completely independent of Soft Machine, but an interesting trajectory that the Miles Davis Electric Band would be using a lot of keyboards and electric keyboards, and the Soft Machine was definitely a band dominated by electric keyboards. And so Robert Wyatt was actually fired in 1971. I think they definitely wanted to keep forging ahead doing instrumental electric jazz, and I get the impression Robert Wyatt wanted to continue the original version of Soft Machine, and that's when he formed Matching Mole, which is Matching Mole in French. I'm probably butchering that. So he actually named his band Soft Machine only in French. And I should point out too that Soft Machine, of course, was named after a William Burroughs novel, which was a really interesting choice. So anyway, Matching Mole, I did a separate video on them, and when I listen to Matching Mole, I really get the impression that that is the direction that Robert Wyatt had actually wanted Soft Machine to go into. There's still a lot of keyboards on it, but there's lyrics and vocals all over the place, and Robert Wyatt's wonderful drumming and a lot of jazz elements, but definitely a more progressive band. Interestingly, with Bill McCormick from Quiet Sun had joined Matching Mole, and Phil Miller and the rest. And so I kind of see that Soft Machine existed after Robert Wyatt left, and then Robert Wyatt formed another Soft Machine that is more true to the original vision. I see a direct correlation between, say, Soft Machine Volume 2 and what he ended up doing in Matching Mole. And so Soft Machine continued. They got a lot of different players in there. John Marshall on drums, and they ended up having Alan Holdsworth and John Etheridge on guitars in later versions, and got to the point where, and Roy Babington, incredible bass player. And it got to the point where the only original member was Mike Ratledge. And those albums are all worthwhile and very interesting, but as I pointed out, I wanted to focus in on the Robert Wyatt years because they were a very special, unique band in that period, and their evolution was fascinating and also very quick. And to see people like David Allen and Kevin Ayers define the sound of the band and then move on so quickly and have them end up being basically an instrumental trio plus a reed player by the time they did their third album, it was pretty incredible. But even within the diversity of all that sound they created in those years, um, there's a core essence that is Soft Machine as we knew them. And I think it's just a unique body of work. They're a completely unique band. And we're also blessed to have tons of video appearances and live shows that were recorded from 1967 all the way to 1971. And so I'll post all those below. Really gives a great look at the band beyond the records to see them doing this material live and see all of their idiosyncrasies in full display. Um, and the fact that we have so much video is really exceptional, and you really get a sense for how loud they were for the kind of music they were doing. No wonder audiences sometimes had difficulties with them. Of course, by 1970, things had changed, and the band was definitely far more accepted and became a yardstick for measuring a lot of progressive bands going forward. And also interesting too that I have to give Soft Machine credit too because between 1970, well, actually 69 and 1970 and 1972 and 1973, there was a lot of keyboard-dominated bands, and so Quatermass comes to mind. I'm not sure if Quatermass would even exist hadn't been for Soft Machine. And then, of course, the Nice and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and all the like. So I think that Soft Machine kind of laid the blueprint for rock, jazz, hybrid bands that had keyboards dominating and weren't featuring guitars, which was definitely a daring step to take in those years because guitars were everywhere. So anyway, my hat's off to Robert Wyatt and Soft Machine, and Robert Wyatt's work after Soft Machine really shows what the possibilities would have been for Soft Machine had he remained in the band, and they kind of went back to their roots, especially when you listen to Matching Mole and then Robert Wyatt's solo albums, End of an Ear and Ruth is Stranger Than Richard. And a lot of that seems like it really shares the spirit of the original Soft Machine. So we're not lacking for a bunch of material from Robert Wyatt and the whole Soft Machine aesthetic, and that's a good thing. And of course, over the years and the decades, their reputation has grown. They've become a very influential band indeed. So anyway, I probably don't need to tell too many people out there about Soft Machine. If you're watching this video, you're probably well aware of the band. But if you haven't explored a lot of the live shows and the live videos that are on YouTube, they're posted below, and you can expand your vision of what you think Soft Machine was all about. Quite a universe of music. Thanks for watching. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.